Hello and welcome to another TLDR UK video. And get ready for things to get meta, because in this video, we're going to be discussing the news and the coverage of the coronavirus. If you spend too much time on Twitter, you can quickly start believing that everyone in Britain wants all journalists jailed, and the BBC is pretty much the 21st century's Das Reich. So in this video, we're going to take a look at what people actually think about coronavirus media coverage, and the state of media more generally. Before we get into it, and if you don't hate all media outlets, I'd like to quickly shine a light onto our new project, The Daily Briefing. Every day at 5 PM, we'll be sharing a summary of the day's news, letting you catch up on everything you've missed in less than 3 minutes. The briefing is available to read in newsletter form, and as a podcast if you want to make things even easier. The link to sign up for the newsletter is in the description, and by doing that, you'll receive the written version and the podcast in your inbox every day. Also, everyone who signs up gets a free TLDR prize, so double reasons for doing so. So, let's get started with this video. Coronavirus and the media. If you listen to, well, most politicians these days, it's taken as an accepted fact that no one trusts the media anymore. Trump's obsession with fake news is probably the most obvious example, but everyone's doing it really. Labour criticised the media for being too anti-Corbyn. The Brexiteers, including some in government at the moment, criticise the media for being too Remainery. Remember Project Fear? And now the Conservatives are criticising the media for what they see as disingenuous gotcha journalism at a time of national crisis. This is probably part of the reason why ministers have stopped appearing in political TV shows, and why Johnson has stopped taking questions from journalists during his briefings. Anyway, the government's distrust in the media was apparently justified in April, when a Sky News poll shared by Health Minister Nadine Dorries on Twitter found that just 24% of people trust TV journalists on the issue of coronavirus, and a massive 64% don't. According to Nadine Dorries' analysis of the data, no one trusts the very left-leaning media on the issue of the coronavirus because they're essentially too critical of a government that's trying its hardest to get this country out of a national crisis. And to be fair to Dorries, she's not alone on this. It's sort of taken for granted in British political discourse at the moment that the media is in fact facing a time of crisis over its coronavirus coverage. And the recent news that many mainstream media organisations were cutting jobs due to the coronavirus has been interpreted as a consequence of the fact that the media has lost the public's trust. But is this really true? Do the public really not trust the media on the issue of the coronavirus? Well, the answer is more complicated than it might look at first. The Sky News poll found low levels of trust in TV journalists generally, but if you break it down to the organisations, then the picture becomes a bit clearer. YouGov polling, conducted at the same time in April, found that trust in the media was about the same as last year, with 47% of people trusting the BBC and 38% of people trusting upmarket newspapers generally. In fact, the same YouGov poll found that there was basically no difference about how much people trusted journalists generally against coronavirus coverage specifically. So it seems that people don't actually distrust the media's coronavirus coverage, or at least any more than they distrust the media generally. The reason all of those media companies are facing redundancy is really that, in a recession, there's less money to go around. Advertisers pay less people buy the papers, and less people are willing to pay for subscriptions, not because they've covered the coronavirus poorly. Other polling done by the Reuters Institute and Oxford University found a similar pattern. While people don't trust journalists generally, that's because when you ask them about journalists, they think about the Sun's journalists and tell you that they don't trust the media. But if you ask them about particular organisations, it turns out they do actually trust the media. And by the way, that's not a partisan dig at the Sun, they just come at the bottom of the list. The point is, if you ask people about the media generally, they say they hate it. But if you actually ask them which bits they hate, it turns out that they only hate specific parts of the media, and they trust the media more than that original Sky News poll suggests. Also, contrary to government opinion, the public doesn't think that journalists are being too harsh on the government over coronavirus. Turns out the public are basically split 3 ways. 26% think that the media have been too critical of the government, 28% think that they've been fair, and 33% think they haven't been critical enough. Unsurprisingly, whether you think the media has been too critical or not critical enough largely depends on whether you're right or left-leaning. Anyway, the point is that the government's narrative that trust in media is dropping because journalists are being inappropriately critical of the government during a time of national crisis is simply wrong. It might be convenient for the government to say that the media are being too critical, and it might justify them skipping interviews, but on the whole, most people think that the government is getting a fair treatment, or even too easy a ride. These people, instead of thinking that the media is out of touch or too critical during the crisis, think that the news media is doing a good job. They see things quite differently from Dorries and others, and view what she describes as tripping the government up and gotcha journalism instead as holding the government to account and making sure they're doing what's right. In fact, some would argue that the very fact the government are complaining is evidence that the media are doing a good job of keeping them to their word and asking the hard questions. Also, it's worth noting that despite Dorries' claims, the majority of mainstream media in the UK actually leans right, and most of the major newspapers actually support the Conservatives. This isn't to say that the media isn't struggling to keep the public's trust though, because it is. Public trust in the media generally, and specific organisations, has been dropping steadily for the last half-decade or so. That same Reuters Oxford University study found that even the BBC, the most popular news organisation in the UK, has seen its trust levels drop by about 10% across the board since 2018. Media generally has seen an even sharper decline, dropping by 12 points since 2015. And we've left the USA in this graphic for an interesting bit of trivia. In the UK, the left trust the news less than the right do, whereas in the US, that's reversed, and it's the right that hate the news more. Anyway, coronavirus seems to have slightly accelerated this trend, and while there was a short-term increase in their credibility at the start of the coronavirus crisis, trust in news organisations has fallen 11 points since April, from 57% to 46%, according to the Oxford Reuters study. But it's worth noting that coronavirus has eroded trust in everything. Even the beloved NHS has seen a 4% drop in trust, while scientists saw a 5% drop, politicians a 13% drop, and the government has seen the biggest drop of all, a monstrous 19% drop from 67% to 48%, putting them at the same level as news organisations. In fact, people are more worried about false information coming from the government than they are from the media, which could explain why government ministers are trying to push attention and blame elsewhere. And this is all consistent with the Reuters Annual Digital Report for 2020, which found that people in the UK are more concerned about false information from politicians than they are from the media. And this shouldn't be surprising when you consider that Johnson has a trust rating of 28% according to YouGov. Anyway, cheap digs at the government aside, the main impact that the coronavirus has had on the media is that it's massively increased news avoidance, i.e., more people than ever are actively trying to avoid the news. People typically avoid the news for two reasons. Either people think that it has a negative effect on their mood, or they think that the news these days is so pervasive that if it's important, they'll find out about it somehow anyway. News avoidance has been steadily rising for a while now. 24% of people said that they often or sometimes avoided the news in 2017, a figure that went up to 35% in 2019. In mid-April, it was 49%, and it's jumped another 10 points to 59% since then. Hopefully, this steep increase is COVID-specific, and people will stop avoiding the news once the pandemic is over. But this general trend is still worrying. In theory, journalists play an important role in a democratic society. They allow the public to hold their politicians to account by keeping them informed of what's going on. If people begin actively avoiding the media, politicians become less accountable because a smaller fraction of the public will know or even care what they're up to. Even if you hate the media, the fact that more and more people are actively making an effort to avoid the news should worry you, because we all want politicians, regardless of their party, to be held to account as much as possible. Anyway, that's the long and short of it. No, people don't just trust the media much more than they used to pre-corona. And no, people don't think that the media's been too critical of the government over this crisis. In fact, if anything, the media has fared better than the government since April. On the other hand, trust in the media has been falling consistently for a while now, and news avoidance has jumped in the last couple of months. Whatever you think of the media, these trends should worry you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Are you avoiding the news? And do you think that the government or media are more trustworthy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, you can also get involved in the conversation over on Discord. And be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. You can also find more from us across all social networks simply by searching for TLDR News. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name listed at the end of the videos just like these people, then be sure to back us on Patreon.